everybody. Investment Committee open session is now called to order. If I could have Pam call the roll, please.
Teresa Taylor,
Here.
Rob Beckner,
Good afternoon.
Henry Jones,
Here.
Lisa Middleton,
Present.
David Miller,
Present.
Stacy Oliveris,
Here.
Jason Perez,
Here.
Ramon Rubalcaba,
Here.
Betty Yee.
Pam, this is Lynn Paquin sitting in for Betty for a couple of minutes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We're going to move on to item number 3, the approval of the June 15th, 2020 Investment Committee timed agenda. What's the pleasure of the committee?
Move approval.
So moved.
So moved by Mr. Jones, seconded by Mr. Miller, I believe. Thank you. I need to have a roll call vote. Sorry about that.
Rob Beckner,
Aye.
Henry Jones,
Aye.
Lisa Middleton,
Aye.
David Miller,
Aye.
Stacy Oliveris,
Aye.
Jason Perez,
Aye.
Ramon Rubalcaba,
Aye.
Lynn Paquin for Betty Yee.
Aye.
Okay, motion carries. Thank you very much, Pam. Executive report, Chief Investment Officer, Mr. May.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, committee members. I would like to take this opportunity to give you an update on how we are managing the portfolio through the COVID-19 crisis, with 3 areas of focus update: the opportunistic strategies, market transactional liquidity, and our own balance sheet liquidity management. It is a difficult time for all of us on many fronts, and it's easy to lose focus of our mission amidst a heightened level of uncertainty. Therefore, after an update on how we are managing the portfolio through the current crisis, I will conclude my opening remarks with a discussion on our long-term focus, which is to generate the actual rate of return of 7% on a nearly $400 billion portfolio in the long run. As you may recall, that our opportunistic strategy program was created mainly to capture 2 types of investment opportunities. First, opportunities that arise from structural changes in the market that are not material enough yet to be incorporated into our strategic benchmark. An example of such a strategy is direct lending in private credit. The second set of opportunities that arise from market dislocation during a crisis, such as COVID-19. These types of opportunities tend to be the result of extreme market dislocations and transitional in nature. This means that it is important to be ready to act quickly for us to capture such opportunities. On this note, we are pleased to report to you that we are benefiting from the work we did in 2019 and early this year. Because of our early preparations in building out our internal due diligence and portfolio construction capabilities, enhancing our liquidity management, as well as establishing relationships with capable external partners, we have been able to proactively capture investment opportunities during the COVID-19 crisis. Thus far, most of these opportunities are in the area of private credit, especially in liquidity and rescue financing, and such strategies are currently implemented as part of the opportunistic strategies program. As an example of the importance of being prepared, in 2019, we started negotiating contingent mandates with 2 distressed credit managers. Distressed credit strategies can generate attractive risk-adjusted returns when markets are in distress, but such crises do not come often. As an all-weather strategy, however, distressed credit strategies become less attractive. Therefore, we structure the mandates with a trigger such that this mandate would be activated only when a certain set of market distress conditions are met, as they were in March this year. The mandates were executed in early 2020, and the triggers were met almost immediately thereafter. Because of these pre-negotiated trigger mandates, plus other investment channels we developed and continue to develop, we have been able to act quickly in taking advantage of market dislocation. That is, to be offensive when the right opportunities presented themselves. A good example of the defensive part of our plan is the implementation of long treasury bonds and factor-weighted equities over the last few years. Combined, these two segments of the portfolio provided drawdown mitigation benefits to the tune of $11 billion from February 20 to March 23rd this year, when the equity market experienced a major drawdown. Now, I would like to give you an update on market transactional liquidity and our own balance sheet liquidity management. Market functioning in equities and treasuries improved dramatically during May relative to the significant stress experienced at the onset of the crisis. The Federal Reserve continues to inject significant amounts of liquidity into the marketplace. Market depth has stabilized within normal historical range, while cost to trade remains somewhat elevated at 1.5 to 2 times the pre-COVID market conditions. Our balance sheet liquidity continues to remain strong. For example, as of June 10, for all the stress scenarios we analyzed, and our Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 liquidity coverage ratio for 7-day, 30-day, and 90-day horizons are all above 1.6 times, which means that even under the most conservative assumptions, our available liquidity sources are more than 60% higher than potential usage. Again, we are benefiting greatly from our 2019 work in developing a comprehensive liquidity management framework. Please note that our liquidity situation is dynamic, and the liquidity coverage ratio analysis is based on some assumptions and our best estimates. We'll continue to monitor and manage our liquidity profile diligently. The creation of a liquidity management framework strikes to balance a variety of trade-offs among potential sources for and the uses of balance sheet liquidity by pairing the negotiability of uses with the reliability of sources. The framework is structured to ensure our most important use of liquidity, such as to pay members' benefit payments, are covered by highly reliable source of liquidity, which are cash and expected receivables. The liquidity on demand nature of our framework is a critical feature in that it balances between having too much liquidity, which can be costly, and holding too little, which can be deadly. So that we will only use liquidity and start paying for liquidity when we need it. Since 2019, we have made substantial improvements to our liquidity management framework and developed numerous pathways we can use to secure cash on short notice. Just in 2019, we negotiated and executed several master repo agreements, total return swap agreements, and a sponsor repo agreement. These steps taken last year provided us with more than $10 billion additional capacity of liquidity on demand. We put this liquidity management framework to test during COVID-19, and we are benefiting greatly from it. We remain confident that we can continue to manage our liquidity profile well to ensure that we can continue to pay our members' benefits and meet other financial obligations. We are humble enough to know that we cannot forecast when and how the crisis would unfold, and we cannot time the market. But what we can do is to develop plans for different future market scenarios. Planning for the future is analogous to having a fire exit sign. It does not tell us when the fire will break out, but instead, it tells us what to do once we see smoke. An enhanced liquidity management framework, additional pathways to liquidity on demand, a centralized governance structure, our proactive outreach to the GP community, and implementation of investment strategies such as factor-weighted equity and long duration risk segments as well as the distressed credit trigger mandates. These are just some of the fire exits that we built into our portfolio prior to COVID-19. As we are managing through this COVID-19 crisis, we continue to benefit from having developed a plan early on. When I'm asked how we are managing the portfolio during this crisis, the answer is rather simple. We had a plan and we are sticking to it. Recent market turmoil has thrown a fresh spotlight on the challenges that public pension funds face in making good on their mission to deliver retirement security to public employees. The discussion on how to meet obligations represents an important debate for policymakers who worry about burdening state and local governments and future generations to secure the benefits that the pensioners depend on. Given the global macroeconomic uncertainty and our mission to provide pensions and health benefits to nearly 2 million public employees in California, it is important for us to focus on our shared challenge, which is to achieve a 7% long-term return on close to $400 billion, and our mission, which is to serve those who serve California. That requires both innovation and a commitment to the long-term plan. Even prior to the pandemic, we knew that in order to achieve our goal of a risk-adjusted return of 7%, we would need to address the market's triple threat of low interest rates, high asset valuation, and low economic growth. So in late 2019, we mapped out an investment strategy to deliver sustainable results over the long term. Our solution is based on better assets and more assets, and will capitalize on our structural advantages, such as a long-term investment horizon and access to private asset classes. CalPERS must diversify and increase exposure to private assets, such as private equity and private credit. We refer to these as better assets because they have the potential for higher returns and lower expected volatility when compared to public traded assets. More assets refers to our plan to thoughtfully utilize a moderate level of leverage as a tool to increase the base of the asset generating return in the portfolio. The use of a moderate level of leverage allows CalPERS to take advantage of the low borrowing cost in today's low interest rate environment and using those funds to acquire assets with potentially higher returns. Well, at the same time, we can maintain proper control and effectively manage risk associated with the use of leverage. The topic of leverage has been raised periodically for several years now. As part of the asset liability management in 2017, a workshop session was held on July 17, 2017, titled Use of Leverage in Strategic Asset Allocation. This session and other discussions and actions since that time have sought to build a framework by which CalPERS may use a moderate amount of leverage to help offset diminished return expectations. We recognize that this approach carries risk. For example, leverage can exacerbate some short-term volatility. However, prudent use of leverage can reduce risk over time by allowing us to keep more exposure in diversifying assets such as U.S. Treasury bonds while pursuing higher returns in other parts of the portfolio. Importantly, the two components of our toward a 7% solution, better assets and more assets, are independent of each other. That is, with or without leverage, we'll attempt to increase our exposure to private assets as better assets in order to increase the expected return of the portfolio. And separately, we may use leverage to gain exposure to more assets so that we can maintain diversification while increasing exposure to higher returning assets, be they public or private. It is also important to note that leverage is no longer applied within any specific strategy, asset class, fund, or deal. Instead, leverage is applied and managed holistically from the total fund perspective. This centralized governance structure and the work done over the past year on building out our liquidity management framework serve to provide confidence that the risks associated with leverage shall be appropriately managed, especially given the moderate amount of leverage contemplated in the near future. We plan to deploy leverage gradually, prudently, and as market opportunities warrant. We have carefully factored in these risks and have implemented a comprehensive, forward-looking risk mitigation plan. Over the last several months, we have meticulously planned a measured shift towards this strategy, improving liquidity management, installing proper controls, and a centralized government framework. Well, there's no panacea in the current market environment. We believe our strategy of better assets and more assets will increase the probability of achieving our goal of a risk-adjusted return of 7% within the next 10 years. But this will require sticking to the long-term path regardless of short-term outcomes. We understand the important role we play in society. Well, we know this is just the beginning. We are positioning ourselves to deliver sustainable returns to our 2 million members for decades to come. So with that, I will pause for any questions you may have.
I don't see any questions. So let's move on to our, thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate your report. Thank you. My iPad logged out, so give me just a second. What happens when you don't have hard copies with you? Let's move on to our action consent item. What's the pleasure of the committee? Number 5, action consent item.
Move approval.
All right, it's moved by Mr. Jones. Second by Mr. Miller. I need to have a roll call vote, Pam.
Rob Fechner,
Aye.
Henry Jones,
Aye.
Lisa Middleton,
Aye.
David Miller,
Aye.
Stacy Oliveris,
Aye.
Jason Perez,
Aye.
Ramon Rubacava,
Aye.
Lynn Paquin for Betty Yee,
Aye.
Great, thank you. Motion carries. We move on to our number 6, our information consent items. I have had a request to pull 6C for comments. So let's pull that, and the comment is from Ms. Brown. Ms. Brown, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to draw Mr. Mang your attention to item 6C, attachment 1, page 1 of 10. This should be easy to find. And that's the quarterly update on performance and risk. And I'm looking at the lower half of the table on private equity. Basically, it appears that at every interval showing, the year to date, 1 year, 3, 5, and 10 year, we are underperforming the benchmark. And it actually appears to be the only asset class that has consistently underperformed the benchmark, yet we continue to pour billions of dollars into these investments. Can you tell me why we continue to throw money at private equity when year in and year out we underperform? My concern is we're taking on greater risk without the reward.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. I think that's question better addressed by Rob Patterson. So Dan BMU, is Rob on the line?
Yeah, Rob's available. Why don't I take a first stab at that, and then we can take it from there. I need to pull Rob in. Let me switch back to it here. So, Ms. Brown, there's a number of things that are in that historical performance. Now, first of all, I would comment that despite the underperformance that you see across with the red, if you look at it relative to sort of the public market alternative, which would be the public equity cap weighted, in basically every time period, the private equity portfolio beats the public equity portfolio. So private equity is very difficult to benchmark, but one benchmark that people consider, and for us certainly, is the opportunity cost relative to the cap weighted. Private equity beats public equity in every historical period, and same thing. And you'll see this in the ALM conversation that we have on item 8A, I believe it is, where our capital market assumptions for private equity are higher than that for public equity. As far as the performance, especially over the long, like the 10-year number, one of the challenges there is we've changed the benchmark a few times. At one point, it was relative to an entirely domestic benchmark. Then it moved to being public equity with a certain geographic split, plus 300 basis points, and a cap weighted plus 300 basis points. And then in our most recent ALM process, we moved to the current benchmark, which is just public equity plus 150 lag 3 months. So one of the challenges, again, in private equity is benchmarking, and it's an evolving benchmark. So I would say that some of the numbers across there are not relative to our current benchmark. And in fact, the numbers are different relative to our current benchmark. But again, I think the most important thing is when we talk about needing to invest more in private equity, one of the big things is the alternative is investing in public equity. And we feel that the private markets are a better alternative. I'm happy to take further questions about that.
Yeah, thank you. I know we did, or you recall when we did adjust the benchmark, but we made it simpler, lower. We adjusted the benchmark lower, so we actually would be able to stumble over it, and it doesn't appear we've been able to do that. But the real question for me is the risk-adjusted return. So yes, we are getting more than we would say with public equities, but we're taking on much greater risk. And so we really need to do something to fix why we aren't meeting the benchmark. And I'm hoping that we're going to come up with some either substantial ways to hit the benchmark or to not throw as much money at private equity. I'm just wondering what we're doing to try to bring our numbers up to the benchmark.
So if the question is about risk adjusted, if you look at the realized risk of private equity, it actually is lower than public equity also. So the realized risk adjusted return is actually even better for private equity now relative to public equity. Now again, we think that Ben has talked about this. The realized performance has the lagging and the smoothing in it. So we actually think that's an artificially low risk. But again, our forecasted risk and volatility, risk and expected returns for private equity is such that that we actually believe the forward-looking risk-adjusted returns are better again for private equity than public equity.
All right, thank you. I don't have any more questions on that item.
All right, thank you, Ms. Brown. Thank you, Mr. Bendino. I am going to move on now to 7, information agenda item, policy and delegation.
Right, thank you. And Jared, if I could please get Kit Crocker moved to attendee from presenter, please, as Kit will be leading this item.
All right, Kit, you should be able to turn on your audio and video.
Okay, how is that? Am I there?
Sounds great.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
You're all good.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Kit Crocker, CalPERS Investment Office. Agenda item 7A is the first reading of staff's proposed updates to the total fund investment policy. And the proposed changes fall into 2 categories: new language in Appendix 5 to codify within policy the PERF benchmark methodology. And then secondarily, changes relating to the opportunistic program intended to reflect recent organizational changes, provide for program oversight by the general pension consultant, and update program constraints to expand potential size of the program, while at the same time facilitating more meaningful oversight by this committee by updating the constraints. Staff has worked closely with Wilshire on both the benchmark methodology provisions and the new policy parameters for the opportunistic program. This is an information item. We're seeking the committee's input at this time. And with that, I'll pause for questions and also invite our consultants, Wilshire and Makita, to comment.
Let's go to, I don't have any questions.
In order to
let's
get
go
Wilshire and, I'm sorry, Mr. Taylor, I'm sorry, in order to get Wilshire and Nikita to be able to comment, can we please bring Steve Hart from Nikita forward as an attendee, and then also bring Tom Toth from Wilshire as an attendee, Jared?
Okay, Tom, you should be able to share your audio and video. No?
Yep. Can everybody
There
hear me?
you go.
Great.
Yeah. And sorry, who was the other person?
The other one is Steve Hart with 2 T's, Hart from Nikita, please.
Okay, I brought him in, but I don't see him online anymore.
Yes, I think I'm online.
Oh, there you
Can
go.
you hear me?
There it is. Yep, all good.
Thanks, Jared. Tom, over to you.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of comments related to the opinion letter. As Kit rightfully laid out, we had a lot of back and forth on the edits and the suggested revisions. 2 broad categories, the benchmark methodology change, as the opinion letter states. We feel it's consistent with what has been previously discussed with the investment committee. So we're comfortable with that, and Wilshire will continue to act in a benchmark oversight role as the investment committee's eyes and ears, and will elevate concerns or questions or issues as we deem necessary to ensure that strong oversight. And then the second broad category really comes within the opportunistic strategies portion of the total fund policy. And I think the biggest change that is being suggested there is the increase in the maximum allocation from 3 to 5%. As we've seen, credit spreads across credit markets rise materially, and the likelihood for a lot of idiosyncratic opportunity to drive returns. We think that relaxing that maximum does make sense. Now, importantly, in the revision, there's 2 things that I think the investment committee should keep in mind. And first and foremost is that these are active positions within the portfolio, and therefore are governed by the active risk limits that the investment committee approves. So the 1.5% active risk target is not changing, will remain intact, and is really a primary governance mechanism for the active positions within the broader portfolio. So that remains as a governor for the risk position in the portfolio. And then secondly, we think the additions to the opportunistic strategy guidelines help to provide stronger oversight. They're replacing what were pretty broad, high-level constraints with more specific strategy and sector constraints, as well as the delegation authority limits. So we think taken all together, those increase the level of oversight that the investment committee will be providing for the opportunistic strategies portfolio. With that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions or comments.
There are, and I hate to do this, guys, but apparently we had public comment on 6C. So before we go to these questions, I would like to go to Kelly Fox with the public comment on 6C.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have 8 people in the queue to speak on item 6C. I'll begin with the first person and put them into the talk mode. They will speak after they hear the beep.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Lynn Nittler, a retired California teacher with my healthcare in CalPERS. I keep close track of the Earth's climate. The atmospheric readings at Hawaii's Mauna Loa Observatory are released every May. The results are deeply troubling as CO2 levels are escalating rapidly. 10 years ago, the May reading was 393 parts per million. This year, a few weeks ago, it jumped to 417. So we added 23.5 parts per million of CO2 to our atmosphere in just 1 decade. Unless we change our ways dramatically by 2030, we could reach 440 parts per million of CO2 by 2030. Scientists have warned us that concentrations of 450 risk triggering extreme weather events and temperature rises as high as 2 degrees centigrade. Beyond that, the effects of global heating are likely to become, in the scientists' words, catastrophic and irreversible. It's not the future we want, and we could be there before 2050. That should be breathtaking. We don't have time for you to divest CalPERS slowly or to see if holding on to fossil fuel investments might pay off eventually. We simply can't afford to put any more CO2 into the atmosphere if we care about a livable planet. Divest now from all fossil fuel investments to do your part to avoid plunging us into climate chaos. The good news is there's no performance trade-off in ridding CalPERS from fossil fuel investments. Morningstar has examined 745 sustainable funds, compared them against 4,150 traditional funds. They matched or beat returns in all categories. Even during this pandemic, CalPERS can lead the way to creating a better future for our beleaguered planet by selling fossil fuel investments, investing green, and come out ahead for pensioners. Here's a Morningstar report, quote, average returns and success rates for sustainable funds suggest that there is no performance trade-off associated with sustainable funds. In fact, a majority of sustainable funds outperform their traditional peers over multiple time horizons, unquote. I am truly puzzled why CalPERS continues to invest in fossil fuels that have cost the fund billions compared to the fossil-free index. In the last 12 months, CalPERS has lost $1 billion just in tar sands investment alone. I hope you will take the urgency of cutting back on CO2 emissions to heart. Thank you. I'm done.
Kelly Fox.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Madam
Kelly?
Chair.
I
Yes.
don't know what these questions are, but that would go to 8C, not 6C. So if these are all the same questions, then they need to do it on 8C at the end of the presentation on climate. And then in addition, was that under 3 minutes?
Yes, I have a stopwatch here.
Okay. So I don't know how we find that out, but my feeling is if they're talking about climate, we should be doing that on 8C.
Okay, Madam Chair, your ruling is to have them speak at 8C, and we'll make that change. Each of these callers had indicated they were speaking on 6C. They're all primarily from fossil-free California. So if you want to move them to item 8C, you can make that announcement, and that's how we'll do it.
I would like it if you would call back for 8C and get back in the queue for that, so that we can continue our investment committee open session until we get to that. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, they will stay in the queue. You have one caller for item 7A when you're completed there.
Okay, so we are not there yet, but let's go on with with Dan and you. I had some questions, so let me go back and see who they were real quick. All Where'd it go? Okay, so I have a question from Mr. Jones and Mr. Fechner. Mr. Jones?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, my question is for Mr. Todd. Tom, you make reference to benchmarks and you talk to the maintaining the 1.5%, 1.5% tracking error as a governance measure. So, from a governance point of view, as a board member, what am I looking at with the tracking area above that's moving higher than 1.5 or going below 1.5? What's going to inform me as to whether or not this asset is performing as it should?
So tracking, thank you, Mr. Jones. Tracking error is meant to capture essentially the differences in the investment portfolio relative to its benchmark. And to the extent that the portfolio takes on active risk, you want to strive to be compensated for that difference between the benchmark and the actual portfolio. So the higher that number, essentially, the more the investment portfolio can differ relative to its benchmark. And it's technically the standard deviation of active returns of the portfolio. So managing that in a risk conscious way, I think is appropriate. And you receive regular reporting in terms of the level of active risk both in the portfolio as well as in the underlying constituents within the fund.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
Mr. Jones,
Yeah,
if it helps on the item that Ms. Brown's question was on regarding the quarterly update on performance and risk, that was the last we talked about. The very next page actually shows your forecast tracking error, and you get that quarterly to this committee. And then actually it also gets posted on the Insight tool monthly for your purview if you need to see it even more frequently than that. We have it out there for on the Insight tool.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Dan, I see it all the time, but I want to know what the impact is from, when it's moving one way or another, And I think Tom explained that. Yeah. Okay. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Fechner?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was wondering, before I made my comment, if Mr. Hart had anything to add.
I don't have on this particular point here. I do have on the total policy revisions. Did have a comment that I wanted to provide when that's appropriate.
All right, thank you. I guess my comment is if there's not a lot of angst or heartburn, is the reason why we have to hold this as a first reading and wait and do the second reading? Not hearing a lot of contention about this. Could we just move this forward as an action item, Madam Chair?
It is fine with me if that's the pleasure of the committee. I do want to hear from Makita, Mr. Hart. So before we take the vote, but I don't have any more comments. So let's hear from Makita and then we can hear the pleasure of the committee.
Well, good afternoon, committee. I did want to make a further comment with regards to the total fund policy. Committee members may recall that prior versions of the suggested changes incorporated a number of other items beyond just the opportunistic program. And a few of those items included the private equity program. And one item in there wanted to bring to the committee's attention for further thought in our monitoring of the private equity program and interactions with staff. One of the areas that is in the private equity program has to do with the targets and the ranges that they have for the different classifications of assets they have within their private equity portfolio, specifically buyouts, credit, growth, opportunistic, and venture. So the item I wanted to bring to the committee's attention was that the buyout segment currently has a target of 65 and a range of 55 to 75% of NAV. And that has been creeping, the actual allocation has been creeping over time and is currently at 70%. And I think that with the continued deployment of capital in private equity is going to be continued to be focused on the buyouts area, and that as they continue to think about co-investments, those are going to be also primarily in the buyouts area. And that what I would suggest is that the committee consider a change to the target ranges for the different classifications, strategy classifications in the private equity, to increase that in the buyouts area and decrease it in credit. The decrease in credit also can make sense because of the growth in the opportunistic program that has some exposure to parts of private credit that could have initially otherwise been considered part of the private equity. So that's no longer going to be done there, going to be done in the private, in the opportunistic program. So specifically would suggest, if it makes sense, to change the range from buyouts from the current allocation of 55 to 75 with the target of 65, and move that to a target of 70 and a range of 60 to 80%. And there'd be a corresponding decrease in the credit program, which currently has a target of 10 and a range of 0 to 15, and to change that to be a target of 5, a range of 0 to 10. Happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Hart, does that change? And I appreciate that. Does that change anything in the delegated, the total fund policy?
It wouldn't be
for it.
It wouldn't be a change actually in the total fund policy, because I believe the private equity program continues to remain as a separate policy. But given the change that's taking place now in the total program policy, and not knowing when we're going to revisit this, and knowing this is a relatively near-term item that had been considered in the previous iterations of the total policy change that included the private equity program, that what we would look to do is to change the private equity program strategy limits and targets. So to your first question about the delegated authority, would not make any changes to delegated authority. We're not looking for any changes there.
Ms. Taylor, to Mr. Beckner's comment previously, we could certainly make that, should the board like to make this an action item, you could certainly make that part of the action item, which would be to update the private equity policy according to what Mr. Hart just said.
Okay, that's what I was, that's why I was diligently writing it down so we get the motion correct. Right. So, okay, I appreciate it.
Certainly be comfortable with those ranges.
Okay, and I'm going to have, when we're ready to do the motion, I have public comment. I'm going to have Mr. Hart go over it again so I get it written correctly, so it's included.
Sure.
But right now I do have, Mr. Fox, I think I have one comment on this, right? 7A. Carolyn. Is he still there? Anybody? I know I had a 7A comment. Karen?
Did you call me, Teresa?
Do I have a commenter, public comment on 7A?
Yes, Mr. Fox.
Hello.
Hi, there we are. Sorry.
Hi, this is JJ Jelensic, member. I had asked at the shareholders meeting why and what impact there was from the change in the benchmark in Appendix 5. I was told that it would be addressed on the call, and I didn't hear anything. But this does not change or increase by even $1 the amount that's available to pay benefits. It narrows the difference between the theoretical return on the board asset allocation and the portfolio performance, but it does reduce the reported benchmark and how much underperformance gets reported in the press, and it does make it easier for the management staff to meet their bonuses. But I really have heard no explanation as to why we want to make this change. And I would ask that the committee actually seriously consider it. And I assume that my whole comments made it through. Starting with, I had asked at the shareholder meeting.
Yes, we heard everything, JJ. Thank you.
Thank you.
Were there any additional comments, Mr. Fox or Ms. Perkins? On 7A?
That concludes the public comments for item 7A.
All right. Thank you so much. Let me make sure I don't have any additional comments. Boy, this gets crowded. Okay. So I would like to know the pleasure of the committee. It was brought up that since there didn't seem to be a lot of questions on the total fund investment policy, that we go ahead and move this to an action item. If that's the case, I need to know the pleasure of the committee.
I so move.
It's been moved by Mr. Fechner. I need a second.
I second.
Second.
Okay, I didn't hear who either of those seconds were.
A second.
I'm not hearing who it is. Who is it?
Second.
Oh, Henry. Gosh, your screen is freezing, so it looks like you're not moving.
Oh, okay. But I'm talking.
Okay, so I have a motion by Mr. Fechner, a second by Mr. Jones. Is that, Mr. Fechner, is that inclusive of changing the PE strategy limits to a target of 70?
It is.
Okay, with the 60 or 80 range, and the, what was the other one, Mr. Hart?
Was a corresponding decrease in the credit related
0 to 10.
from a target of 10 to a target of 5, and decrease in the range from 0 to 15 currently to 0 to 10.
Okay, that is all
Ms.
in
Taylor,
the. Go ahead.
Sorry, just to make sure that the minutes have this captured accurately, it would be taking the buyout target from 65 to 70, and from the range from 55 to 75 to being a new range of 60 to 80, and it would have a corresponding decrease in credit going from the target of 10 to a target of 5, moving from 0 to 15 as a range to a range of 0 to 10% of the overall private equity program.
Got it.
Steve, do I have that right?
That's correct, yes. In Appendix 3 of the private equity program, Table A, strategy allocation targets and ranges.
Okay, I'm going to assume that made it into the minutes. The motion's been made, the second's been made. I need a roll call for the vote.
Rob Fechner,
Aye.
Henry Jones,
Aye.
Lisa Middleton,
Aye.
David Miller,
Aye.
Stacy Oliveris,
Aye.
Jason Perez,
No.
Ramon Rubalcaba,
Aye.
Betty Yee,
Aye.
7 ayes,
Okay.
Madam Chair, and 1 no by Jason Perez.
Okay, the motion carries. So we are now going to move on to 8, agenda item 8, information, agenda item ALM mid-cycle review. A.
Thanks, Ms. Taylor.
Thank you,
Jared,
Madam
if you could, yep. I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Ben, really, let me do this and then I'll let you introduce. If we can move Kit Crocker, Tom Tote, and Steve Hart from panelist to attendee. And then if we could please move Eric Baggeson, Christine Reese, and Diane Sandoval, members of the management team, from attendee to panelist. And then if we could also please move our consultants, Steve Peresti and Steve McCourt, again, from attendee to panelist, please. So those are Eric Baggeson, Christine Reese, Diane Sandoval, Steve Foresti, and Steve McCord.
Okay, so I moved everyone in, but I don't have any options for Christine Reese. I cannot make her a panelist for some reason.
Was earlier, I thought. Can you move along without her right now, or?
Christine, are you dialed in?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, there we go. So Christine is dialed in and not on video.
Thanks, Jared. Ben, over to you to introduce.
Yep, thank you, Dan. Madam Chairman, members committee. So this item, if you may recall, our last asset and liability management workshop was 2017 to 18 fiscal year, and then the next one will be 2021 to 2022. But so this is a mid-cycle review where we give you update on economic conditions, asset class valuation, and more importantly, an update on the capital market assumptions. So without further ado, I will turn over to my team.
Okay, I think this is me, Eric Baggison, Managing Investment Director for Trust Level Portfolio Management. Basically, our speaker this afternoon is going to be Diane Sandoval. She's going to cover just 2 slides of the attached material, basically dealing with the capital market assumptions and then the next steps in the ALM process. But the whole COVID crisis has really kind of thrown market valuation statistics and characteristics basically into a tailspin. I think without any further ado, I'll just turn it over to Diane, and we'll be happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Thank you, Eric. Diane Sandoval, Trust Level Portfolio Management. If I can ask that everyone please turn to page 6. I will walk through that page. Thank you. So what I have here is charted each asset segment for the Public Employees Retirement Fund along the x-axis, and the asset segment forward-looking returns on the y-axis. In the orange boxes, I show the range of forward-looking return estimates per asset segment. Excuse me, in 2017, where median 2017 asset segment estimate is captured by the white triangle. And the black bracket illustrates the range of forward-looking return estimates per asset segment as of the end of March 2020. And the black circle illustrates the median estimate for the same period. So one of the key takeaways I want to point out in this chart is the heightened uncertainty being expressed through this survey of investors today versus in 2017. This is illustrated by the dramatic increase in the range of expected returns across every asset class. While I would normally expect the range of outcomes to be the biggest in private asset classes, where the ability to add alpha is the highest, what we see in these forecasts is that the range of outcomes has substantially increased for every asset segment, including in fixed income, to levels even higher than what I would expect in private asset classes. So let me give you an example. In 2017, the difference between the minimum forecasted return and the maximum forecasted return for private equity was about 230 basis points. For real assets, the difference was 285 basis points. Every other asset class had a lower dispersion of estimates. Today, that difference for private equity has widened to over 700 basis points. More importantly, the difference for global equities widened by over 500 basis points, and even U.S. Treasuries has widened over 400 basis points. This tells us that experienced investors with reasonable approaches for forecasting asset segment returns can reach very different conclusions about the next 10 years. And these differences have to do largely with the shape and timing of the economic recovery from COVID and the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policies to bring stability to the market. The second observation I would like to make about this chart is that in the almost 9 years that I've been doing this work for CalPERS, this is the first time that I have seen negative return estimates from reasonable investors in U.S. Treasuries, or quite frankly, in any asset segment. Now, the reasons for these negative yield forecasts are varied. Some believe that there is a lower floor of zero or close to zero for U.S. Treasuries. Thus, interest rates or Treasuries offer asymmetric return profile with a limited ability for upside and a higher degree of downside if rates go up. Others are looking at all-time low current yield, and still others argue that in more modern portfolio theory, investors should be willing to pay for protection or defensive assets, so future returns will be negative because this asset class has provided pretty spectacular defensive property. So just, fiscal year to date, treasuries are up over 19%. Of course, you can see in the range of forecasted return estimates that there's a lot of debate on this topic. And this is why we're also committing to undertake an important effort in collaboration with our research and strategy group and the global fixed income team under the leadership of Kevin Winter and Arnie Phillips to understand if U.S. Treasuries will continue to serve the current role of diversifying our equity risk, or if there are more cost-effective alternative diversifiers to equity risk that we should consider using in our next ALM process. Before I move on, I really want to reiterate that the capital market assumptions are critical input into the portfolio construction process, which is rigorously assessed through our 4-year asset liability management review. In 2017, the board went through this ALM process, resulting in a total fund portfolio with an expected return of 6.11% over the next 10 years and 7% over the long term. If I look at the last bar to the far right, I illustrate that if we simply took the median averages from the March 31st, 2020 survey as the expected return for each asset segment and weighted them by our current strategic asset allocation rates, it would leave us close to the bottom of the previous range established in 2017. This reiterates the difficulties that the investment office faces in meeting the 7% challenge with a conventional portfolio and the need for more assets and better assets. I also want to reiterate that we are specifically not attempting to adopt new capital market assumptions at this point, simply because the degree of market uncertainty does not provide us with sufficient confidence to recommend a change at this point. Now, page 7 shows a very similar results for the affiliate funds in terms of a wider dispersion of outcomes and lower global fixed income estimates. So if I can now turn to page 9, where we've outlined the next steps. Thank you. Since we will be reviewing our ALM timeline and CMA process with you at the board at the July board offsite, I won't spend too much time on this other than to reiterate that the key areas of focus for us in the next ALM review in terms of research will be 1, for the curve, focused on the role of U.S. Treasuries and the potential alternatives, as well as revisiting the asset segment constraints. And 2, for the affiliate funds, we will be focused on reviewing the role of U.S. Treasuries and potential alternatives. We will be revisiting the role of inflation assets and potential alternatives. And we will be assessing the cost-benefit analysis of adding factor-weighted and high-yield segments. With that, I will conclude my remarks and turn this back over to you, Eric. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know at this point in time whether or not the folks from Wilshire Associates, Steve Foresti or Steve McCourt, would care to make any comments from Nikita.
This is Steve Foresti from Wilshire. Just want to make sure that that my microphone is live.
It is.
Great. Good
Yes,
afternoon, everyone. The only comments I'd make would just be to underscore a couple of the points that Diane made. Number one, I think even when we go through the ALM cycle, we're always, I think very diligent about making sure that we point to the asset class assumptions, what we know, what uncertainty lies out there, and are just quite frankly just humble about the risk around the assumptions. I think the point I'd like to underscore that Diane made today is just in light of the current economic environment, the additional uncertainty that the COVID and partial economic shutdown add to that, the outlook's even less certain. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's more risk of undershoot or overshoot to the assumptions, but rather there's more risk to missing on either side of that. So I think, all else equal, that would be just another reason to have a bit of caution around the precision that even the median estimates that have been collected suggest. The final point I'll make, as we at Wilshire look at our assumptions versus how they stood during the ALM cycle in 2017-18, there's been a lot of moves in the markets and the economy. Rates have, at first kind of came out of that environment and moved up and have recently come down quite extensively. But as we look at the expected return through Wilshire's assumptions for CalPERS portfolio over the next 10 years, we've just seen a very modest change, a reduction of maybe 20 basis points from what we would have expected the portfolio with the same allocation to look like 3 years ago. So all that being said, I think as staff has laid out, and as you review the mid-cycle ALM, it looks very much to us like the portfolio that's in place is appropriate, prudent, and the conversations you've had around the objective of moving towards or maintaining a 7% long-term return target. I think all of those conversations set you up very well for the next full ALM cycle. Happy to take any questions, but I just want to underscore those points.
Great. Did we want, that Wilshire, did we want Makita?
Yeah, I without repeating what staff and Steve had mentioned already, the one thing I would highlight for the committee is the potentially the most impactful dynamic from the pandemic and the policy responses to it for forward-looking asset allocation decisions is the dramatic reduction in interest rates, which have the direct impact of reducing forward-looking returns for fixed income instruments, but also tend to also reduce the expected returns for other types of asset classes as well. So it's obviously far too early to tell how permanent or semi-permanent the reduction in interest rates is, but as staff continues on its journey in asset allocation, that would be the major, one of the major factors I'd pay close attention to.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Ms. Yee, you had a couple of questions? You're muted.
There I am. Okay, thank you. Just one question. Diane touched upon the comparison of the 10-year rate and the long-term rate as compared to 2017. And I was just curious about, given the Fed's recent meeting last week about a prolonged recovery and unlikely that the federal funds rate will increase. I was just looking at the estimated inflation at this mid-year point compared to 2017. I couldn't tell. Could you comment about that?
Diane, do you have that one?
I think she went away for a minute.
Okay.
I'm here. I'm sorry. I was talking, but I think I was muted. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you. What I was saying was I just wanted to reiterate the question. Is the question, what are our updated results for inflation?
Yeah.
In terms of the survey. So this is actually interesting. The inflation results have not really changed over the next 10 years. They're still at 2%. And that's actually very much the median survey result for inflation was literally spot on 2%. And I think the reason for that is because if you think about over the short term what's happened with the crisis, those effects have been somewhat deflationary in the short term. And I think there's still quite a lot of uncertainty as to how the structural changes will pan out that will impact inflation the most. So what is going to happen with our supply chain, and if we're going to need to build redundancies into that or not. Obviously, certain areas have really fallen in inflation, like oil and energy and transport and airlines, and right. But then in food, that might be a very different topic. So, interestingly enough, we have not seen much of a change in the forecast on inflation.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is that it, Betty? Okay. Okay, so I also have a question from Stacey Oliveira. Ms. Oliveira?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is also for Diane. It's a little unfortunate what's happening. And so as I look at these charts, I'm not really seeing a great picture in terms of what the future holds, especially as we're looking at potentially negative interest rates. We've seen that happen in Europe. I know we're going to get a presentation on this in July, but I'd like to just get a quick overview of what some of the alternatives are for treasuries right now.
Yeah, and I'll let Eric speak to this as well. But I mean, really, what we've been looking at so far has been pretty different. Other ways of bringing diversity into our portfolio, like our factor weighted equities, which have lower drawdowns, or even high yields, which have slightly lower drawdowns and higher recoveries or faster recoveries than treasuries. So I wouldn't say they're necessarily exactly replacements for treasuries, but they do bring more diversification into the portfolio. And we have seen that they were pretty effective during the recent crisis in March.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe this is Eric. Maybe I could just add a slight comment to that. And thanks, Diane, because you have it exactly right. Even at the low interest rates that currently exist, Ms. Oliveras, we saw, for example, when the market sold off over 500 basis points last week, Treasuries still, even from these low interest rates, actually provided diversification against the equity drawdown that was happening. So we still think that there's some utility, albeit that utility, from all practical purposes, has to be diminished when you have interest rates that are sub 100 basis points, for example, on these. But it is not inconceivable that interest rates on treasuries could go negative, just as they have in many European sovereign issues. So as long as there is movement potential for the interest rate to decline, there is still an element of diversification. And at this point in time, the only other alternative that we would have, basically, to try to deploy the capital that is currently allocated to treasuries would be basically to just put it right into equity risk, which would potentially exacerbate any significant, further drawdowns that might be in the offing. So I don't think, for me personally, that's not a recommendation that I would be willing to make at this point. Of course, that could always be overridden by Ben and Dan and the perspective of the investment office, but we do not see a point at this moment in time to abandon whatever diversification we still do get from treasuries.
Okay, Eric, now it's Ben. Sorry, Stacey, go ahead.
You're probably going to answer this, but at what point would we consider abandoning it? I think we're at 66 bips or somewhere around there right now. At what point do we have to reconsider?
Yeah, so on that point, since Eric invited me to come in, let's step back a little bit. So as you know that, we are constantly, discussion or conversations with our global peers, our market researchers and leading thought leaders in the space. And one of the topics that you see really divergence of view is about the future of U.S. Treasuries. Will the interest rate go up or go down from here? And that also kind of hinges on inflation, as Diane pointed out as well. There is a really large dispersion in forecast of inflation and the interest rate going forward. So that's the big picture. But if you think about the roles we expect U.S. Treasury to play in our portfolio, there are three roles we expect Treasury to play in our portfolio. One is income generating, the other one is being liquidity provider, and then the last one is really diversification to equity drawdowns. Let's think about the first one, income generating. You're absolutely right. Given the low yield environment, the income generating capability of the treasuries has diminished somewhat. And liquidity, given that, we talk about our enhanced balance sheet liquidity management framework, having Treasury, holding Treasury as a source of liquidity becoming less critical. It's still important consideration, but less important now. So now the key question is really going forward, can Treasury continue to provide diversification benefits to potential equity drawdowns? And as Dan just pointed out, one of our next steps is really to continue to study what's the role for Treasury to play in our portfolio. So as Eric said, we're not there yet, but this definitely is a topic front and center, for the investment office, and we'll continue to do our research, and we'll come back to the committee before we formulate a view, and we continue working with your consultant on this topic as well.
Thank you.
Okay, we also have public comments. And if you could get the timer on my screen, and Kelly Fox, if you could get the person on. I think it's JJ.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yes, I do have the caller coming in, Mr. JJ Jelensik, on item 8A.
Can you hear me?
Sure can.
I don't know whether you can hear me or not. Okay, thank you. I'm glad that this is an information item because, quite frankly, if you look at the agenda item, the analysis does not support a change. But I'd also point out that the analysis does not support a decision not to make a change. A review that contains no analysis is not much of a review, and is certainly not much of an aid to the board. The information provided makes it clear that the world has changed. Among other things, you're being told that 30% of your asset allocation is likely to return a third less than you had assumed. But you're also told that this will have no fiscal impact. And all I can say to that is, really? Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I want to make sure I don't have any additional questions on this before I move on. Right, so I do not. So let's move on to 8B, the Consultant Public Fund Universe Report.
All right, so let me get our panelists in, and then I'll let Ben introduce this one too. So let's start, Jared. Yeah, we can move Eric Fageson, Christine Reese, Diane Sandoval, Steve Foresky, and Steve McCourt back into the attendee area, and then if we could bring Tom Toth from Wilshire into the panelist area. Ben, over to you.
Hi, Tom. You should be able to turn on your audio and video.
I have. Can everybody hear me okay? Great.
Yes,
So I will try to be concise with my comments, but I think there's some interesting data points in here that should help inform the discussion as we move forward, particularly as it relates to asset allocation. If you'd flip forward to page 2, this is the universe comparison of the CalPERS results relative to other large plans defined as greater than $10 billion in size. This is a report that we have historically done in September of each year, but we've moved it into March. So these timeframes are all as of the end of Q1. So over the last year, on a relative basis versus other large peers, the portfolio ranks in the top quartile. So very strong universe rankings over that last year. Over the, I'll call it the intermediate timeframes, 3, 4, 5 years, the portfolio ranks right around median, give or take a handful of percentile. The 10-year number at the 65th percentile is where that universe comparison becomes a bit less favorable, and I think it's helpful to try to ascertain why that is. Now, before I get there, I think it's important to remember on the next 2 pages, pages 3 and 4, that the plan in aggregate does exhibit less risk than the median plan, and you can see that on page 3 because it plots in the upper left-hand quartile. which is kind of where you want to be. That's more return for less risk, and that's true in over the 3-year period and close over 5 years. You plotted the median return, but with less risk, as you can see on page 4. Now, page 5 starts to, I think, illustrate some of the drivers of the differences between the CalPERS portfolio and other large public plan universe. This is consistent with past presentations. You can see the portfolio does tend to have an overweight to global fixed income, ranking in the top quartile there in terms of its asset allocation weight. If you add up the US equity and international equity weights, the portfolio is also a bit above median with a more global orientation. As you can see, a median allocation to US equity and a top quartile allocation to non-US equity. And it's that public equity which is really being traded off against private equity. So you can see the second from the right column that the asset allocation ranks towards the bottom of the universe. And over this last 10-year period, as Dan pointed out in the performance report, and as Ben has talked as well, private equity really has been a very strong driver of performance. So when you take those two things together, a higher allocation to global fixed income and a lower allocation to less liquid private equity, that starts to explain some of that 10-year performance. As we get into the portfolio, if you flip to the next page 6, the global public equity portfolio has generally plotted right around the median, except for that 10-year time horizon. You can see that while the universe dispersion narrows quite a bit, the portfolio is ranked in the 83rd percentile. And I contrast that with the page 8, the private equity universe comparison. I think this is pertinent as we talk about that going forward, to use the terminology you've heard, investment in better assets. The CalPERS private equity portfolio actually ranks rather well versus other large peers over longer time horizons. So over 7 and 10 years, it ranks close to the top third in the 37th percentile. Now, as a driver of overall portfolio returns, because of its lower weight, that hasn't had the same impact as some of your other large peers. The asset allocation chart showed that in the median allocation of private equity in this universe was somewhere in the neighborhood of 18% versus the 8% target, and a bit less actually invested within the CalPERS portfolio. It's also worth keeping in mind, and not news, I think, to the committee members, that finding the right strong private equity private equity opportunities that will actually move the needle in a portfolio of CalPERS' size is a challenge. And then finally, as I wrap up here on page 10, I did mention that the portfolio does tend to have a higher allocation to global fixed income. When we look at the results of the global fixed income portfolio, you can see that it ranks at or near the top across all time periods. So and that's driven by two primary factors. One is the strategic direction of the global fixed income portfolio, which does have a higher duration component, as well as the active management that the global fixed income team has produced over time. When you put all of those together and compare them to the broader fixed income universe for large plans, you can see some very strong relative results. Let me stop there and see if there are questions on the universe comparisons.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the report. I had a couple of questions. Number one, and I think I've asked you guys to do this before, can you make these bigger? For those of us who are older?
We can try. There is a lot of white space on here, so let me see if we can blow it up to make it a little bit easier to read. I know there's a lot of real small numbers there.
Yeah, no, it's just, it's real tiny, and yeah, on the iPad, I can, squeeze it and make it bigger and stuff, but it's just difficult to read. Especially if this were a slideshow on the auditorium, that would be really hard.
Right.
Additionally, then my other question is, if we are, I just have a hard time looking at this. If we're comparing ourselves to other pension funds that aren't as complex as ours, because we have, what is it, 3,000 some odd different types of pensions based on our city and local, et cetera, et cetera. But also, $10 billion isn't even close to us. I'm wondering if we should start paring that universe down a little bit to be more reflective, or pull in other funds that are more reflective of our funds, so that we can get a better comparison. Because when you're a larger fund, one of the things we talked about a minute ago was the inability to deploy funds in private equity, and that I've heard often that comes from us being so big, and it's not worth our time to be deploying little amounts of funds in private equity. So I'm wondering if the universe comparison could be a little more closer to who we are, reflecting the complexity of our membership and the fund itself.
Madam Chair, those are all very fair points. And I think that the challenge is you start increasing that cutoff, and the universe just continues to shrink, although we can certainly take a look and see what those numbers show. I think the second point is more pertinent, and that's to your point about complexity. Ultimately, this portfolio needs to be managed relative to the CalPERS commitments, not relative to how it looks versus other public plans. And I think while this is useful information, I'm generally leery of universe comparisons for that simple fact. This is CalPERS has very specific defined liabilities, and this portfolio should be managed to meet those liabilities over time. Maybe that's similar to other large public plans, but maybe there are some differences. And so, while we'll continue to give you this information, I certainly would caution anybody who would look to try to use this as justification for why a portfolio's strategy should be shifted.
Great, and I get that. I have another question from Ms. Oliver. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Tom. This is great. As we look at page 5 of 14, Ms. Taylor commented on private equity. I'm trying to understand why we ranked 79th when it comes to liquidity and cash.
So simply the weight of liquidity in the portfolio at 1% is at that 79th percentile versus some of the other peers here. You can see that the 50th percentile is closer to 3.75%. That's just based on the targeted asset allocation. This is not a judgment on the liquidity position of the portfolio in aggregate, which, as staff has pointed out, is a much more complex management facet than just a targeted allocation to cash.
Yeah, let me rephrase my question. I understand what this says. I want to know your opinion on it in terms of where we stand with our liquidity position.
I think the liquidity position at 1% is appropriate, given the other areas of liquidity that can be tapped if necessary. One of the things Ben has said around liquidity is that too much liquidity is costly and too little liquidity is deadly. And ultimately, it's a balancing between looking to generate returns and then looking to have safety. So I think at a 1% position, that seems reasonable. And in fact, as we look at doing optimizations utilizing our asset class expectations. We were talking about that a little bit previously. Generally speaking, unless you put constraints in terms of the level of liquidity you want in the portfolio, given the dearth of expected returns there, it tends to
Right.
fall out completely.
Yeah. We're not expecting great yield from short-term securities right now.
Right.
Short-term treasuries. Yeah. Thank you.
My next question is from Ms. Middleton.
Tom, thank you. This is really good. And my questions come back to private equity, and I think you touched on this in your answer just previous to Ms. Oliveras, but what I'm reading here is that compared to other institutional investors, we have less in private equity, that we are doing well comparatively in the investments that we do have. That would seem to argue, notwithstanding that you always have to look at the specific deal in front of you, that the strategy that we've adopted of increasing our assets in private equity is heading in the right direction. Am I missing something?
Ms. Middleton, no, I don't think you're missing anything. I think those are spot on.
Thank you.
Right. I don't have any additional questions, and I do not believe I have any public comments on this one. So thank you very much, Mr. Toth. That was a great report, except for how tiny it is.
Thanks very much.
All right. Moving on to 8C. That's our investment strategy on climate change.
Yeah, Jared, can I ask you to move Tom back to attendee, and if we can move Ann Simpson, Divya Mantrikar, and Daniel Ingram from attendee to presenter, that would be great.
I'm sorry, who was that last one?
The last one was Daniel Ingram from Wilshire.
Ingram, got it. Okay, and Divya, you should be able to turn on your audio and video. And Mr. Ingram, you should also be able to turn on your audio and video.
Okay, Divya and Ann, are you ready?
Yes.
And you are on mute, Ann.
It's not showing she's on mute. So I think
Ann having audio problem. So Divya, are you online?
I am, and I can go ahead.
Thank
you, Divya. Yeah, please go ahead, Divya.
Great. So I think we can start on slide 2 of this deck. And thank you, everyone. Divya Mantrikar, Investment Manager, Strategy and Board Institute of the Investment Office. If we go to slide 2.
Divya?
Yes?
I can't hardly hear you. I don't know if you need to be closer to your mic or put a headset on.
Is that better?
Much better.
Okay, sorry. So if we can go to slide 2 of this deck, I can review a few slides, and thank you everyone for reviewing the slides and the report. We're just going to cover 3 slides here in the interest of time, and then leave plenty of time for questions and answers, of course. So this item is to discuss our draft Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures report. It's our first short report in response to the guidance. created by the Financial Stability Board. And we have really taken the advantage to showcase a lot of work that has been developed by CalPERS over years in recognition that climate change presents risks and opportunities to CalPERS. As an intergenerational and universal owner with a global diversified portfolio, there's really nowhere that we can hide from climate change. And so this report helps to explain how we consider the major risks and opportunities to our portfolio and what activities we've undertaken to mitigate those risks where we can. I think we have Anne off of mute now. I can continue, or Anne, if you wanted to take over from, we wanted to now go to slide 9, which covers one of the highlights of the report.
Statements and look as if he is
Someone's not on mute.
Thank
Someone's
you.
not on
Thank
mute.
you.
Hold on, Ann. Someone's talking and not on mute. Thank you. Go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Divya, for kicking us off. As Divya rightly said, the reason that CalPERS considers climate change as part of its investment strategy is we see both the risk and the opportunity to the portfolio. So this is our first report to the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Everything goes by an acronym these days, right? And in the 60+ pages that we've given you, we've really set out in great detail the strategy that CalPERS has developed, which reflects our size. In other words, we are globally exposed, and it also shows the potential impact for the strategy that we're developing. So the strategy that our board adopted for climate change was as one element in our strategy on sustainable investment. And you'll see that we've set out on one of the slides, that strategy has 3 parts. The first is engagement. And that's where we as the, no, we don't need to go back, it's okay. Thank you. That's engagement. That's where we use our influence as the provider of capital to companies, as the owners, the co-owners of these companies. The second part of our strategy is advocacy. And that's where we talk to the policymakers and regulators around the world to make sure that we have the rules in place so that the market does what the market does best. The third element in our strategy is integration. And that's where we use all of this data and analysis to help us as investors make more intelligent and better informed long-term decisions. What underpins all of this is partnership, because although CalPERS is one of the largest asset owners in the world, whenever we move on a systemic risk like climate change, we need to partner with others. So the slide that we're on at the moment shows you some highlights from the report to show you what we've been doing with our engagement part of the strategy. I'm glad to say, working with Divya Mankikar, who's one of the key architects of this project, the original data and the design, CalPERS convened and became a co-founder of what many of you will know as Climate Action 100+. Now, why does that matter? It's because what we did was look at our whole portfolio and identify where the biggest sources of the emissions were coming from. And we found that the majority came from just 100 companies. So we've teamed up with other investors globally, and now the signatory base for this initiative has $40 trillion in assets under management, which makes it, if we believe, it's the largest shareholder action project that's been attempted on a specific issue. So just to give a sense of what these 100 companies are responsible for in terms of emissions, you'll see at the end of the report, we've got a very detailed appendix which sets out the emissions of these companies and then calculates how much difference it would make if these companies came in line with what we're asking for, which is to set targets that get us to net zero emissions by 2050. Could we have the next slide? Thank you. So we started this project. It was launched at the One Planet Summit. Thank you very much to the controller. She was there and took that lead role, getting us launched at that important global meeting. We want to just flag in the report that the companies that we're engaging are responsible for such an enormous amount of emissions that even just looking at their direct and indirect emissions, what gets called scope 1 and 2, comes to about 55 gigatons. Now, a gigaton, I certainly know, is very hard to even imagine quite how big that is. But we've calculated that those 55 gigatons are the equivalent to taking 12 billion cars off the road. And some have said that we're being too ambitious in this project because we're taking on the biggest global emitters of greenhouse gases. But what we've given you is a few examples on this slide to show you that we're having impact in companies in different markets and in different sectors, and very heavy emitting sectors like oil and gas, cement, steel making, and also good old Pepsi Cola and Nestle. So we're looking at the totality of emissions for companies, which is why this is a very ambitious project. And our goal is each company gets to net zero by 2050. Could we go to slide 11? Thank you. The second element in our strategy recognizes that the markets can suffer from a lack of information, and that makes them less efficient. So one of our goals here is to have mandatory climate risk reporting. I'm glad to say this is being teed up for part of the agenda for COP26, which will be in Glasgow next year. We've also been working hard at the SEC and also at the International Accounting Standards community to get this essential information integrated into company reporting. This builds on the TCFD, which is currently a voluntary framework. We're also feeling very hopeful about the prospects for expanding carbon pricing into new markets. Some of you will have seen there were no less than 8 different bills going through Congress in the United States, looking at different ways to bring carbon pricing forward. And another element, of course, is the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. Both of our priorities in advocacy are designed to foster market efficiency. And from an investor's point of view, pricing externalities, getting the flow of information that investors need is absolutely essential when we're thinking about risk and return. Could we go to the next slide? Thank you. So this is just a snapshot from the very detailed data work that's been done by CalPERS. And Divya has led this work, but I do want to credit all of our asset classes who took this question of digging in on both transition risk and physical risk across sectors, across asset classes, took this work very seriously and put a tremendous amount of thought, care, and analysis into this work. We also commissioned external data providers to give us independent assessment of where we think we are making a difference on the investment decisions that we're taking. Can I go to the next slide? Thank you. Here, just for visual purposes, is a range of the partnerships through which we're working. They range from the United Nations to the Vatican to groups like PRI, Ceres, and of course, Climate Action 100+, which is very much something that CalPERS put into motion. So finally, let's look at the last slide. So here's the question. In doing this tremendous amount of work, what did we learn? The first is that the real economy is not on track to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. I think this is well understood, but our portfolio reflects the real economy because of our size and our global diversification. That means that our strategy has to get to the root cause of greenhouse gas emissions, which are causing global warming. There are many factors, but the part that's under the control of public and private and civil society groups, the emissions which are coming out of the real economy. And that's what our strategy is designed to have an impact on. So through Climate Action 100+, we're modeling what the impact of that will be. Through advocacy, we're focusing on the flow of data and information for the pricing of risk and opportunity. And on integration, you'll see that in line with our target rates of return, CalPERS is already finding very attractive investment opportunities. And we have assessed that about 18% of our private markets investments are broadly termed climate solutions. So the other message from this big and very detailed report is we have to do two things. The first is we need to build resilience on climate change in our portfolio. So some of the work that you'll see in the report, which looks at modeling vulnerability to physical risk, is very important for us, making sure that we understand the risks the portfolio is exposed to, and secondly, quite properly in line with CalPERS investment beliefs, that those risks are being rewarded. And the second is that when we're taking opportunities in line with climate change, we need to make sure that we have got that 7% target rate of return front and center. Because if we fall down on that fiduciary duty, then the consequences for our members are really very serious indeed. So the message finally from this report, we were writing it just as the COVID-19 impact was being felt around the world and with its brutal impact on communities. And we've said this and we wanted to finish with this message. When tackling a systemic risk, the lessons are evident. We need vision, we need partnership, and a relentless pursuit of science to drive decision making. And when we're fiduciaries and we're allocating the capital for our members, nothing could be more important. So Divya is our expert on the climate change data and analysis in this report, and she and I would be glad to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne and Divya. Great reports. I read through the entire TCFD report. I was very happy with it. I do know that, yes, we are not on track to net zero by 2050, and that's because our portfolio reflects the entire economy. But and I appreciate what you've got here at the end. I really hope that we are looking to work harder, drill down some more on some more of these companies to get to where we need to be. But I applaud the work you have already done. It's really, really good work. So thank you very much for a great report. I do have a question from Ms. Go ahead, Betty.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Thank you, Teresa. Let me also add my compliments to Anne and to Divya. This report has only been possible because of all of the years of work that both of them have done, and certainly the leadership position that both of them have, really thrust CalPERS in a global setting relative to how we continue to do this work on climate risk. And I have to say how historic this report is. Reading through it, I just see a lot of potential for moving the needle with respect to setting an expectation for companies to also report in this manner. The fact that we have scope 3 emissions information here is telling companies this is not impossible to disclose. And so I think this is really a game changer with respect to no longer dragging our feet on the in response to the TCFD framework. So thank you both for really just putting CalPERS out there as a leader in this regard. I have a couple of questions, and that is, I guess now in terms of incorporating this work into our ALM process, and this is really, as you said, both about capturing and really identifying where the risks are, but also looking at some solutions and opportunities. And so I wanted to first just ask, how will this work be incorporated, and if you can describe perhaps how the asset classes will use this information going forward to transition the portfolio to a more sustainable one, hopefully meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, but as you said, very much focused on our 7% return.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that, for those kind words, Controller Yi, and also Madam Chair. We greatly appreciate that. I'd like to answer the first part and then ask Ben to comment on the ALM process.
Great.
The first part, and this I think reflects the tremendous work Divya has been leading, so she may like to add to this. The asset classes are already using this information. When you see in the report, sector by sector, the guidance from the TCFD was to, start with energy and get all the way down to agriculture. The building of that analysis on risk was done across the asset classes. So Divya, let me just ask you to add a little more on that, because I think it really is the foundation of the report. And then ask Ben to comment on where he sees the value of this type of analysis for the benchmark work. So Divya.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Thank you. And thank you both, Madam Chair and Controller Yi, for your comments. They're very appreciated. So in terms of how we are working with asset classes to integrate this information, I can use an example of really how we developed the report as it has gained some momentum. So we looked with the asset classes, the cross-asset class team, at transition risks, which are changes in consumer demand that might drive revenue one way or another for companies, changes in technology, for example, scaling up the availability of EVs, and changes in policy, for example, carbon pricing. And then we also looked at physical research developed by Wellington and Wood Hole Research Center, and really went asset class by asset class to say, how does this impact your investment decisions? And one of the things that we heard back from our peers is, for example, we have a colleague in fixed income who engaged some transportation companies on the back of this and learned that, sure enough, it's in the report as well, there's a rail company operating in the southern United States that has had higher exposure to extreme heat and is spending more CapEx on replacing rail ties. So we're seeing those impacts already occur in our portfolio and seeing companies respond to increased climate change. And I think one of the main benefits of this research is that the asset classes are asking more detailed questions from their portfolio companies and then using that information to integrate across their sort of sector approaches. But I'll turn to Ben for the response to your other question.
Thanks, Divya. Controller Yi, thank you for the question. Yes, we understand that one tool among many to address our exposure to climate risk is to consider climate data in our benchmark. The research for this is underway, and the new development is that we're seeking a university partner to help us validate the data and the models that exist. And by doing this, we can incorporate the most verifiable evidence into such a decision at the appropriate time. As you may recall, the CalPERS commissioned the Sustainable Investment Research Initiative, or what we call in short, SURE, to review the evidence as we develop our strategic strategy plan, the 5-year strategic plan. So this new work, or what we call Series 3 on climate change, will form the third round of that project. So the research is underway. Another point, as we just the item right in front of us now, is also highlighted the challenge we face in terms of the data. The TCFD only requiring voluntary reporting data, and this is the first time that we among other TCFD participants are disclosing voluntary data. So as Anne and Divya mentioned, we would need to see mandatory data and also some standardization of data. And with data and the research and science and evidence, we'll make a decision at the appropriate time.
Thank you. And I guess on that last point, maybe back to Anne. So what can CalPERS do in terms of really appealing to other institutional investors to engage with their companies? similarly, so we can have more to work with and hopefully get some more accelerated and expanded considerations for these types of disclosures and decisions.
Yeah, and you went away again.
Hello, am I back?
Yes.
Thank you. There's two pieces of equipment going on at the same time. I apologize greatly. You've raised a very important point, Controller Yee, and I think what we need to do is get out of the world of treating voluntary reporting as an end in itself. It's a means to an end. It's where we develop best practices, we experiment, we pilot, but then if we don't get it mandatory and integrated into the financials, we're never going to move the money. So I think making that argument, and we know because we have some wonderful groups like SASB and the GRI and Series doing fantastic work, PRI doing fantastic work, but at the end of the day, if you don't get this in with the financials, the markets will not move the money because they have no way to ensure that it's standardized, as Ben said, that it's timely, that it's relevant, or that it's verified. So, 150 years ago, all of that was true of financial accounting, and it took a lot of work to get US GAAP and IFRS overseas. So, but we are feeling hopeful with COP26 next year that Mark Carney, who's special advisor to the UN, that he is actually now championing this, even though TCFD started off life as a voluntary framework. So it's sort of time for a little more ambition. And investors, that's for whom these reports are produced. So the customer is always right? We, the investors, we're the customer for financial reporting, so make sure it's got what we need as long-term universal owners. So I think there's great possibilities in the next round. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for the great work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yee. I just wanted to also reiterate, and I think Ben and I have discussed this before, and I agree. We need mandatory reporting. We're in no position to get that through advocacy right now, I think, through the federal government, and get rid of fossil fuel subsidies as a must as well. So I guess my question is, in the meantime, the advocacy that we have to wait for a little bit and hope that we can get in to get it passed soon, not just in California, but federally. In the meantime, as we're asking for more companies to do what we're doing, do the TCFD reporting, et cetera, we have really good successes. We don't have a lot, but I'd like to see, we have huge companies though, but at the same time, how do we double down and get more results without, the mandatory stuff? Because right now we're in a position where we can't get the mandatory stuff. So I guess I'm just asking for some of your ideas. I know this is a difficult position to be in. We're kind of stuck.
Well, if it was easy to do, it probably wouldn't be worth doing. So if we're tackling an issue as big as this, we should expect to commit our very best ideas, work with others, and then stay the course, be committed. So I'd just like to say that internationally, the European Commission is actually moving on this. And this has now posed a question to the SEC. CalPERS has long had a seat on the Investor Advisory Committee at the SEC. I'm very honored that that's currently me. And what we have written is a whole series of recommendations, reviewing the evidence, reviewing the data that we don't have as much as the data that we do, and making the financial case for the reporting. Now, the final piece of work that we've just done is pointing to the fact that US companies are going to start to be at a disadvantage in the capital markets, because if investors don't feel confident about how companies are mitigating these risks, how they're redeploying capital for the long term, how they're picking up the technology, how they're dealing with the impact on their employees and their communities. You know, that's all part of the Climate Action 100 Plus agenda. And, you know, they're going to have, you know, the competition will eat their breakfast, maybe eat their lunch as well. But it's very interesting to see how this has now turned into a competitive issue between companies. And it's global markets. We're a global investor, so we just need to keep moving. And I have to give credit to the chair of the SEC, Jay Clayton, because he is really very thoughtful about the fact that we've got a 21st century economy and we've got 19th century thinking about reporting. Those are my words, not his, by the way. But, you know, backwards looking, fixed point in time with a focus on tangible assets. So, you know, the time is right for really thinking about what investors need by way of information, not just because of climate change, but because of the nature of what the economy really is. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Ann. Also, because we engage like we do, I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what would happen if we weren't there to engage, as big as we are.
Well, here's the thing. What's our theory of change? Our theory of change is this, that we provide the capital to companies. We have ownership rights where we hold equity. And we're also saying that climate change brings two risks. One is transition risk. That's, wow, what's going to happen to this company as they have to, if it's a utility, they're going to move from coal to gas to renewables. These are very big changes. And we want that company to be successful. So that's one consideration. But there's a second, which is if we walk away from the companies where these emissions continue to belch out into the atmosphere, we're still vulnerable. Because even if we don't own a piece of that company, we're going to feel the impact of those emissions. So we need to get to the spigot. We need to turn off the spigot through a new strategy for these companies, which is a very ambitious thing to do. But the examples that we're showing you in oil, in cement, in agriculture, show that by being very clear and very specific with companies, what do they need to do? This target of net zero by 2050 means about an 80% cut in emissions in the biggest group of emitters in industry. So even if it was a question of walk away because it all feels too difficult and too tough, we don't mitigate the risk. You still have global warming because those emissions are continuing to belch out. So it's a problem if you don't want to solve, you're going to have to. So it's a question of rolling your sleeves up and getting on with it. And you can't do that if you're not there, if you're not an owner. And also, we've been able to show it's not just that it's CalPERS, building this alliance of $40 trillion globally, where we're asset owners right around the world, asset managers in every market are joining us. That is really going to be the force of the fiduciary, bringing to bear for the risk and for the opportunity on behalf of our members.
Well, again, thank you, Ann. Thank you, Divya. This is a great report, great answers to our questions. I want to roll up my sleeves and work harder. Let us know what we can do for you. We will continue to work on this and get it in line to where we need to be. So let's triple our efforts and do that. Thank you. I've got
Thank you.
Public commenters on 8C. So, Fox, Kelly?
Oh, Teresa, I actually had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see yours. I saw Lisa Middleton's. I didn't see yours. She pulled hers back. Go ahead. Go ahead, Stacey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Divya and Ann, this is a very compelling report and so timely. As we struggle with the COVID pandemic, there have been many articles and studies, most notably from Harvard School of Public Health, on the relationship between climate change and pandemic risk. And so as it seems as our climate will continue to change, right? We can't completely put that to a stop. that we have increasing risk from pandemics, which will, of course, incur healthcare costs, increase liabilities, and suppress economic returns. What are we looking at in this space in terms of 10, 20, 30 years ahead?
Ms. Oliveros, thank you very much for that thoughtful question. I think when we're looking ahead in that way, we're looking for a theory of everything. We're looking for joined up thinking, a company that tackles climate change but doesn't take care of its technology and innovation, doesn't look after its employees, doesn't look after its reputation, is going to fail. And I think, you know, some years back when they were launched, CalPERS was one of the first investors to recognize the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are 17 which were adopted by close to 200 governments. And we've said, you know, this is the world's to-do list. And it includes issues of gender equality, inequality, the future of work, health, and really provides a framework in which governments are attempting to not just understand these individual risks, but how they compound each other, how, you know, what's the domino effect as one issue hits another. And I think the board's aware that our chief executive, Marcy Frost, sits on a special panel that the UN Secretary General drew together precisely to look at, well, what are the financial markets going to make of this framework of holistic thinking for sustainable development? Because I think if we don't, you know, start to look at these issues in an integrated way, we're not going to make progress. And I do feel that's very consistent with CalPERS investment beliefs. You know, our 3 forms of capital that we highlight, that long-term value means stewardship of financial capital, but also human capital, physical capital. And the relationship between all 3 are not just the source of risk when things go wrong, they're also the sense of the potential returns, which were precisely the board was hearing all about today in the important work that Ben's leading in the investment office. So we can't pick and choose particular issues. We've got to understand the relationship between risks. And I think this new research project, which Ben just mentioned, Series 3, is going to give us an opportunity not just to dig in more deeply on the climate issue, but it's going to help us understand how these other factors are going to accelerate and affect progress, because nothing proceeds in a neat and tidy linear way. The connectivity between issues, the catalytic effect from one issue to another is going to be an extremely important part of this. Thank you.
What about the healthcare impact? So as we have pandemics, right? If the risk of pandemic increases with climate change, then we're going to see more healthcare impacts. We're going to see an increase in our liabilities. Are we working with healthcare insurers to look at their models?
That isn't something that we've done. We've kept a fairly clear, bright line between the 3 sides of the shop at CalPERS, the portfolio, the health, and the pension system for benefits. So I think that would be a question for Marcy. I feel that's above my pay grade. But my understanding is that there needs to be a careful separation for administrative purposes. But Marcy or other person will be able to give a better answer on that.
Thank you. And yeah, there really isn't a policy reason why we would keep the healthcare analysis and data outside of the portfolio. We have been looking at opportunities where if we can invest in healthcare types of assets that would help us with our long-term liabilities, that would be a win-win for the 2 policy areas of the program or of CalPERS. So I don't think we've looked at it from that healthcare side. I think that's a legitimate question that we should go back and take a look at. But there is no reason why we would be prevented from doing so. It's great insight. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Marcy. Again, thank you, Ann and Divya. I'm going to move on to our caller, and Kelly Fox.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have several callers, and I will start with the first one on item 8C, and that would be Leonard Schuyler.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello. Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Leonard Sklar, and I'm a CalPERS retiree, and I'm concerned about CalPERS investments in fossil fuel companies, especially those companies that are developing new sources of so-called extreme fossil fuels, particularly from tar sands and fracking. My concern grows out of my career as a professor in the Earth and Climate Sciences Department at San Francisco State University, where my research was focused on understanding how climate change is affecting water resources in California and around the world. And I want to, first of all, thank you for producing the TCFD report. It is very important advance and shows continued leadership by CalPERS on addressing climate change. And want to make that clear. We're very pleased with this report. But I also want to point to a key limitation that I see to CalPERS' strategy of engagement, and that is engaging with companies whose business model fundamentally relies on carbon emissions. For example, CalPERS owns several $1 billion worth of tar sands exploration companies, and the only way to reduce the emissions from these companies is to reduce the activity of the company, ideally to shut them down completely, the way Michael Bloomberg's company bought coal power plants, and shut them down. In the context of our climate goals, exploration and development of new extreme fossil fuels are simply not legitimate business activities from a climate safety point of view. And what makes them extreme is the high cost of exploiting these marginal fossil fuel sources. Extracting oil from tar sands is only profitable if oil prices are very high, but oil prices are now at historic lows and may never recover, due in part to competition from low-cost renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. But I have to say, as a CalPERS retiree, it's a bitter irony that the good news of rapidly falling costs of renewable energy means bad news for aspects of my pension fund. And CalPERS is losing money by investing in tar sands and fracking companies, and to my knowledge, failing to reap the benefits of the boom in renewables. So I urge you to change your algorithm for selecting companies to invest in. Why can't CalPERS equity investments track the S&P 500 fossil-free index, which over the last several years has outperformed the market as a whole and greatly outperformed the fossil fuel-based energy sector? I mean, if the University of California pension fund can manage its $130 billion portfolio without subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, why can't CalPERS? So I'm making this comment today not only as a climate scientist and as a concerned CalPERS retiree, but also as a father. My son graduated from high school just last Friday. He and his generation face a very scary future. By investing our pension money in these extreme fossil fuel companies, CalPERS is putting my son's future at risk, as well as the future of my pension. So please direct CalPERS staff to draft a plan for an orderly wind down of CalPERS investments in the fossil fuel sector,
Leonard, I'm
starting
sorry.
with the companies engaged in tar sands. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Go ahead, Kelly, with the next person.
Yeah, Madam Chair, it just takes a couple minutes to go through the process here on the online access. So the next caller, Ferris Kawar, are you timing these as well, Madam Chair? And if you are, I'm timing them, but it doesn't seem like they can hear me.
I think he was ignoring us. So yes, I have a clock as well.
I'll make the announcement at 3 minutes. And Mr. Ferris Kawar on item 6C.
Thank you. Yes, this is Ferris Kawar. I have been a CalPERS member for over 11 years. And in that time, there have been many indicators that the fossil fuel industry is not the best investment for us. You know, headline after headline from cities, states, foreign nations show that they're passing laws to move away from the burning of fossil fuels. Military leaders and the world's top scientists have all, urged the transition from fossil fuel products by the year 2030, or the consequences will be too much for any of our systems to handle. Yet, our CalPERS still has over 30 billion of our investments locked up in a product that everyone agrees should not be used anymore. In addition, in the decade since I've been a member, the fossil fuel sector has consistently lost billions, in fact. And based on analysis of public security filings over the past 10 years, the CalPERS Retirement Fund would have generated an additional $11.9 billion had the funds divested their fossil fuel stocks a decade ago. We need to take a stand for what is not only right, but for what will protect our members' investments and afford us a solid financial retirement, as well as a livable and enjoyable planet on which to retire. I urge CalPERS to rapidly shed its fossil fuel holdings and reinvest in clean energy companies, which is one of the only sectors that can really provide enough good-paying jobs to rebuild the economy we need so badly. I appreciate your net zero emissions goal by 2050, but it's not aggressive enough to avoid the worst impacts of a warming planet by, we should really be doing it by 2030. I also appreciate your willingness to engage with companies, but it only can work on industries like you mentioned, cement and agricultural industries, but not on industries like oil, gas, coal, because it's the primary business and it's a product that is unburnable. You have had decades to pressure these companies to become energy providers as opposed to fossil fuel providers, but we just simply don't have enough to show for it. I would much rather see divestment as the next logical step. Finally, I would also suggest expanding the list of 100 companies that you're looking at to 200, which are have been well researched in the fossilfreeindexes.com. I suggest taking a look at those. And I appreciate your time and the direction you're going. I would just like to see it accelerated. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Our next comment, Kelly, when you can queue them up.
Madam Chair, next we have Richard Godfrey.
Go ahead, Mr. Godfrey.
Mr. Godfrey, go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, Mr. Godfrey, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be very short because I'm in the midst of a Rotary webinar. I just want to thank you all for the work you do. I want to totally support any direction, and it looks like you're looking seriously at the issues of climate change and are making changes in that direction. I'm also representing the Union of, United Churches of Christ, and as you know, we divested in 2013. University of California was divested. We look forward to your divestment. We feel very strongly that you're going to make the right choices, and hopefully you do that in good order. And thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Okay, Madam Chair, we have Vanessa Warheit.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Vanessa Warheit. I'm Executive Director of Fossil Free California, and my mother had intended to speak today, but she's a retiree, CalPERS retiree. I'm speaking on my own behalf. I signed up to speak to item 6C because what I have to say is actually about financial risk of fossil fuels and not about climate change per se, because the fossil fuel energy sector has suffered more than any other sector in the current recession. It suffers from huge oversupply coupled with shrinking demand, and this was even before the pandemic. Falling oil prices had already made fracking and tar sands a money-losing proposition. They were highly leveraged and financed by junk bonds. During the pandemic, oil prices plummeted, and banks have now begun threatening to seize the assets of fossil fuel companies that can't pay back their loans. CalPERS suffered huge losses in its fossil fuel holdings in both equities and bonds. As of June 30th, 2 years ago, CalPERS held $2.7 billion in fossil fuel bonds, including in companies that have since failed or are now nearing bankruptcy. Unfortunately, a large share owner like CalPERS will be last in line to get paid when these companies fail or when they're acquired for pennies on the dollar. Intolerable risk and miserable returns are the hallmark of fossil fuel companies today, large and small. On the small side, there's the California Resources Corporation heading into bankruptcy while handing out its CEO a $10 million bonus. And ExxonMobil, which was once the darling of the stock market and one of CalPERS's largest holdings, has seen its share price decline 42% over the past year. CalPERS lost nearly $279 million in value from 8.5 million shares in Exxon alone. As other callers have told you, extreme fuel extraction is the riskiest. During this recent crash, CalPERS holdings in just 23 tar sands and fracking companies lost $1.5 billion in value in just 9 months. And even prior to the crash, between June 30th of last year and February 21st of 2020, CalPERS holdings in tar sands and fracking companies were already negative 3.3%. This is part of a long-standing trend of poor performance. The financial picture moving forward continues to indicate that peak oil demand may have already been reached. Demand for renewable energy will soon outpace demand for fossil fuels, and oil prices will never recover enough to support the economics of extreme fuels. Put it bluntly, continuing to invest in fossil fuels is financially irresponsible, and these losses were predicted prior to the pandemic and could have been avoided. There's no longer any justification for gambling with our public employees' retirement savings on these toxic investments. And I would like to submit some charts to the board to illustrate these losses, but I understand that for some reason you decided not to take written comments for this meeting, and I'd appreciate it if our written comments would be accepted into the public record. But I'd like someone to respond to that particular request, please. Thank you.
Kelly, can she mail that to us?
Mr. Jacobs.
Yes, direction was given that they would be able to provide their public comments as well.
In writing?
That's correct, Madam Chair.
Okay. And yes, go ahead, Marcy, I think you were going to say something.
Kelly took care of it. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Madam Chair, our next caller is Sarah Seiss.
Hi, my name is Sarah Seiss. I'm a CalPERS retiree and fossil-free California board member. We also appreciate the enormous effort behind the report and the wealth of information in it, including the attempt to quantify the portfolio's risk and its contribution to the remaining carbon budget. And this is despite inadequate data, especially as to Scope 3. The report names the problem. The portfolio's public asset classes have a warming potential of 3.23 Celsius, tracking that of the wider world economy. But we respectfully disagree that the strategy laid out in the report is sufficient given the speed and enormity of the unfolding climate disaster. First, I wondered whether the goals based on the 2018 IPCC report are already outdated. Last November, the UN Environmental Program Emissions Gap Report found that global emissions have to fall by 7.6% each year from now till 2030 to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius ceiling. Second, as has been acknowledged, the pace of data availability trails the rise of greenhouse gas emissions, so waiting for better data seems highly problematic, especially as to Scope 3 emissions. Third, as reported, about 1% of the portfolio is in climate change solutions versus about 10% in fossil fuel related businesses. Per the report, most private equity assets in the report's analysis won't be held beyond 2030, but that doesn't match up to the need to cut emissions drastically in the next 10 years. And finally, given this timeline, the planet's timeline, we urge CalPERS to measure success in greenhouse gas reductions rather than promises, especially with fossil fuel companies. Thank you. And I'll have a public comment at the end as well.
Thank you. Go ahead, Kelly.
Okay, Ms. Thies, I will put you back into the queue to speak on agenda item 10. All right, Madam Chair, we have Mr. Doug Thompson.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm also a CalPERS member. I'm calling in today to urge board members to support divestment from the fossil fuel industry. There are both risk-based and public policy reasons for this. The sector has been losing value, especially as people reduce use of transportation fuels. The steep drop in oil prices during the pandemic is a sign of more uncertainty and volatility to come. We see teleworking becoming the norm for many office workers as an example of this shifting market. The TCFD staff report does a nice job citing the risks posed to CalPERS' other holdings, fixed assets like real estate and infrastructure, and its potential disruption of portfolio companies' supply chains and operations. The report cites climate impacts on food security, migration, water supply, other ecosystem services that could bring heightened volatility to financial markets and harm economic growth. As to matters of public policy, I have career experiences related to our state's legislative and executive direction going back now 15 to 20 years. Our state's encouraged and effectively mandated through programs like cap and trade, reduced fossil fuel use. We shouldn't be investing in markets that state policies are working with good reason to effectively diminish. I think you now have further legislative direction under SB 185 requiring divestment from companies earning half or more of the revenues from coal mining. These policy directions are driven by concern for public health and the environment because fossil fuel combustion is the chief source of greenhouse gases, of smog and small particles, which, as it happens, make our lungs more susceptible to respiratory viruses. Today, there's new urgency for racial justice to be considered. U.S. EPA has data published in the American Journal of Public Health revealing that race is an even more profound predictor of particle exposure than poverty. African Americans have a 54% greater exposure to small particles than the general population. Thus, fossil fuel combustion compromises their ability, in particular, to fight viruses. It could be one key to the higher death rates they are experiencing that the governor spoke of in his press conference today. I don't want my retirement funds helping to prop up a dying and volatile sector that's leaving a dangerous and unjust legacy for ourselves and future generations. I hope you'll agree this is not a good retirement plan for any of us, and we'll move on to a serious discussion of fossil fuel divestment. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question or another commenter?
Yes, Madam Chair. The last commenter on item 8C, Sheila Thorne.
Hi, my name is Sheila Thorne, and I'm a retired member of CFA and a CalPERS beneficiary concerned about climate change. I question the strategy of relying on your role in the Climate Action 100+ group to address climate change. Your revised Addressing Climate Change report considers one of the, quote, significant impacts of engagement, the fact that Shell announced targets for reductions every 3 to 5 years towards a goal of shrinking its net carbon footprint by about half by 2050, and agreed to include its emissions among its supply and demand chains, scopes 1, 2, and 3. 1/2 of net carbon emissions by 2050 is far from Paris goals and hardly something to boast about. But the clincher is that according to an article in the Financial Times, May 17, 2020, A disclaimer at the end of Shell's announcement states that Shell will not change its strategy or capital deployment plans in line with the announcement until society acts. What does Shell mean by society acting? Apparently, it does not mean shareholder engagement. It is going ahead with a new project in Nigeria to produce 30 million tons of liquefied natural gas a year to meet what expects to be double demand by 2040. Your report also lists as an accomplishment of engagement Chevron's recent announced production goals for greenhouse gas intensity in production. However, Chevron plans to double its production in the Permian Basin over the next 5 years and expects 900,000 barrels by 2023. Thus, its overall emissions, and especially Scope 3 emissions, will rise. Chevron also opposed a majority-passed but non-binding resolution that it disclose its lobbying expenditures on climate change and has refused to say if and how it will implement it. LA Times, May 2020. ExxonMobil, in doublespeak like Chevron, promises a reduction of flaring and methane emissions while planning to triple daily production in the Permian Basin. Overall, your report admits that only 9% of companies in the Climate Action 100 Plus group have targets in line with the Paris Agreement goals, and only 8% have lobbying activities that are aligned with necessary climate action. The big picture of Climate Action 100 Plus is that the oil companies announce misleading targets of reduced carbon intensity rather than absolute greenhouse gas reduction, or set goals of net zero by 2050 without outlining concrete interim steps. Oil firms tout resolutions with Climate Action 100 to maintain support of their investors, while actually making huge hydrocarbon investments in a foolhardy expectation of increased demand through 2040. Is big oil gaming us? It's time to disinvest from these hopeless and financially failing companies and invest in a sustainable and just green future. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay, Kelly, was that it?
Okay. Madam Chair, that concludes item 8C. You'll have 4 callers on item 10.
Great, thank you. We will move on to summary of committee direction, please. I guess that's Mr. Bang.
Madam Chair, yes, Madam Chair, I did not notice any committee direction for the open session.
Okay, can't remember either, so let's hope that's right.
Yeah, Ms. Taylor, I would only note Ms. Oliveros' comment about looking at the TCFD report and potential impacts to healthcare. And so we'll go back and take a look at it. It won't make it in this this report, but we'll take a look at that.
Great idea. And thank you, Ms. Oliveros, for that recommendation. All right, thank you. We will move on to public comment. So Mr. Fox, we're back to you.
All right, Madam Chair, our first caller is Mr. Al Darby.
Hello, Madam Chair and board members. Al Darby, RPA President. I was surprised to hear from Wilshire today that the PERF is still overweight in non-U.S. stocks and underweight in U.S. stocks. The U.S. market has outperformed the non-U.S. market over the past 3 years. How much did the PERF lose over the past 3 years due to the U.S. market being underweight by CalPERS, while the U.S. market was up 50% and outperforming the non-U.S. market? This problem was identified 2 years ago. When will something be evident that there's some change in the allocation of U.S. and non-U.S. stocks to take advantage of the better performance from U.S. stocks? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Darby. Next person, Mr. Fox.
Madam Chair, the next caller is Glenn Maloney.
I'm here. Can you folks hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Madam Chair and board members, thank you for taking my call. I'm calling from Connecticut. My name is Glenn Maloney. I have worked at a hospital up here called Rockville General Hospital for the past 19 years. I am an AFT Connecticut member, Local 5121, in the capacity of a chief steward. As I understand, CalPERS invests in companies like Leonard Green. Leonard Green owns a company called Prospect Medical Holdings, who acquired us 4 years ago. Since that time, things haven't been that good. 2 years ago, we were promised to have a money match put back into our pension plans, and evidently that fell through. So we've been 9 years waiting for any company to give us something towards our pension plan, and so far we've gotten nothing. We currently, our hospital, after the pandemic or during the pandemic, it is almost half closed. We have no operating rooms are being used. We have no ICU. We have no preoperative department, no postoperative. We have no elective surgeries going on at our hospital. We have no gift shop. We have no patient wings. What we see is we are being slowly strangled, if you want to put it that way. We're getting no communication from Prospect Medical Holdings as far as anything in detailed writing that they will stand by. A lot of vague memos. A lot of vague memos that we can't hold them to. We have employees who are not given direction as far as whether they're going to have a job next week. We have another department closing, presumably on the 26th. So I read articles about Leonard Green collecting millions of dollars in fees and dividends from Prospect, and we're sitting here not knowing if we're going to have a hospital to go to in the not too distant future. Every employee is struggling. There's just a lot of stuff going on, and I asked if I was the one loaning. I know my time's almost up. If I was the one loaning Leonard Green money,
you have to bring it to a close, please.
I'm sorry.
Bring it to a close.
I didn't quite hear that. I'm sorry. The time's up?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Fox, next person.
Madam Chair, the next person, same subject, Kristen Ellis.
Hello. I'll try not to reiterate what Glenn already said. My name is Kristen Ellis. I'm an RN employee of RGH Rockville Hospital, which is an ECHN, 3 different places: Manchester, Woodlake, a nursing home, and Rockville Hospital. I want to thank you for taking our call tonight and about my concerns about Prospect Medical Holdings. I appreciate your concern for the bigger picture of society and environment, which I learned a lot today, and holding companies accountable that you invest in. We hoped that when we were purchased by them in 2016, that the financial backing and the business expertise would help our hospitals thrive. We've been grossly disappointed, as Glenn pointed out, and not only in the lack of progress, but we are actually going backwards, as he described, in areas especially that should be profitable. The lies that we've been told in not returning our money match after being promised verbally in a meeting and in a letter, and closing our profitable and shrinking our hospital, telling us things for months that this would not happen, and then it does, is just like a bunch of lies, as well as not withholding a negotiated three-way agreement, which and they said the reason why they weren't withholding that agreement was because it wasn't working for them. Doesn't matter that it was signed and negotiated. Our PPE was limited, as I realized it was everywhere during the pandemic. But when I asked last week if the COVID admissions were decreased and why we are still sterilizing masks, I was told, there was no answer for me. I was told to ask in a meeting about that next week, which was today, and I did, and I still haven't really gotten an answer of why that's going on. I feel they're using the pandemic to save money and further agendas. Leonard Green, as Glenn said, has accepted millions in dividends and fees, and they're taking a lot of money that's needed from these hospitals that need improvements and development of their facilities, not in threat of losing jobs for employees. I don't think that this is a conduct that you would align yourselves with in light of what I've heard here today. They also have recently denied staff a $5 hazard pay during this pandemic when lots of places have been, even Dunkin' Donuts and everything, Home Depot have been giving their employees like $3, $5. Instead, they gave us 3%.
I'm sorry, your time is
like
up.
30 cents.
I'm sorry, your time is up.
You. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Fox, next person.
Madam Chair, Sarah Thies.
I'm sorry.
Sarah Thies will be talking again.
Okay, thank you.
I can't get her to connect now, so I'll skip to the next caller. The name is David, did not provide his last name.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, I did provide my last name. I'm David Soares. I'm an annuitant, retired after 32 years as a prosecutor in Silicon Valley. I'm currently an assistant area director with the California Retired Public Employees Association. And my public comment is to express my concern about Chief Investment Officer Meng conducting his business in the press rather than during this meeting. And there's already been some reporting beyond that in the Financial Times of London and in Bloomberg. And I'm particularly concerned because Mr. Meng explained to Bloomberg yesterday, June 15th, that the likelihood of success of his strategy to apply leverage, the 20% leverage to the fund, is as follows, and I quote, "Even if Meng succeeds in allocating more money to private assets and adding leverage," he said CalPERS' chances of hitting its 7% target return over a decade will still be less than 50-50. That's the quote from Bloomberg. In other words, adding risk of not just missing return targets, but adding the risk of actually losing trust assets to creditor failure and bankruptcy during the coming global pandemic downturn has less likelihood of success than guessing when a coin flip will turn up heads. Even under the modern interpretation of the law of trusts and fiduciary duty, the prudent investor rule requires that a fiduciary avoid speculation and waste of trust assets. Speculation is defined as purchasing risky investments that present the possibility of large profits, but also pose a higher than average probability of loss. A bet that has less likelihood of success than a coin flip is speculative per se. Given that this afternoon's asset liability management mid-cycle review presentation indicates that no asset class is expected to return anywhere near the 7% 10-year expected return, except possibly private equity, which just barely will get over the line. Mr. Mung's leverage strategy is speculative in nature, and by its very nature is an inappropriate strategy for a fiduciary charged with protecting public trust assets to pursue. If the board president of CalPERS and the chief executive officer had political relationships with the governor and the legislature and the leadership of our local agencies, a better strategy in this return environment would be to work on coming up with a plan for deferring costs relating to lower returns further down the road, rather than engaging in speculation unlawfully with trust assets. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Soares. Kelly, did Sarah get on or not?
Yes, she is called back. I'm going to try to enter her in.
Okay.
Hi, this is Sarah Thies again, a CalPERS retiree and board member of Fossil Free California. Pursuant to SB 185 in 2015, CalPERS began the process of divesting from thermal coal companies that generated 50% or more of their revenue from mining thermal coal. CalPERS remained invested in 3 companies after each informed CalPERS that it was transitioning its business model to clean energy generation. As we wrote in a letter to you that you got on Friday, these companies have not kept their promises. Adara Energy has steadily increased coal output and revenues. XRO's coal mines recorded all-time production highs last year. And despite being a diversified company, Bamboo's coal revenue and production have remained steady. While these companies may be using a bit less energy these days to produce coal or otherwise playing around the edges, they seem to remain deeply committed to coal as a primary or major source of revenue. We hope that the board will ask staff to look at these companies, and if, as it appears to us, they have not been transitioning to cleaner energy generation, then it's time to remove them from CalPERS' portfolio. Please don't reward their failure to make significant progress in 5 years with more years of engagement. And then second, we also looked at CalPERS coal holdings below the 50% revenue threshold through a database run by coalexit.org. Companies in that database make 30% or more of their revenue from coal or meet other criteria. CalPERS' total investment in these companies is in the $7 to $8 billion range. While we don't have access to data on the percentage of these investments that are specifically in coal, the presence of the companies on the coal exit database demonstrates that these are actually major coal holdings for CalPERS. Following the current crash, it's predicted that the coal industry will never recover, even with the continued build out in India and elsewhere. And it's time for CalPERS to finally get out of coal. Thank you so much for your attention so late in the day.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fox, is that the end of our comments?
We have one more commenter, Mr. Ken Lee.
Hi, yeah. I just want to make a quick comment on as a general credit on the investment strategy. Given the size of the CalPERS, it is I think this is not in the position to cherry pick, which is the ESG investment, or for that matter, is any other investment strategy. It would be like an elephant in the room trying to pick and choose where you stand. So the result would be failing to meet return expectation. So if this is a 50 billion hedge fund, then it's perfectly okay to pick and choose. But if this is a 300 billion fund, then they just don't have the luxury to choose. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I don't know what's going on.
Madam Chair, that concludes the public comments.
Great. Great. Thank you very much. So that's the end of our agenda for the Investment Committee open session. I am adjourning our committee at 5:45, and we'll adjourn tomorrow morning. I don't know what time. Rob?
Ms. Taylor, we begin at 8 a.m. with Pension and Benefits Committee.
All right, great. 8 a.m. Thank you so much. We will adjourn for now. Thank you very much.